Boa tarde. Boa tarde.
Boa tarde.
Deixa eu só mudar aqui. Boa tarde, mais um evento do Tiaços. Obrigado pela presença de todos. Hoje nós vamos receber uma querida convidada, Ruth Williams, de Londres. Seja bem-vinda, Ruth. Prazer receber você aqui conosco. Vou fazer primeiro a apresentação formal, Ruth. Ruth vai falar para nós, vai falar hoje, o tema dela é Alma e Espírito na análise junguiana. Ruth Williams é analista de data e supervisora da Associação de Analistas Junguianos de Londres. Ela é autora do livro Jung, Os Fundamentos e Explorando a Espiritualidade a partir de uma perspectiva pós-junguiana, reflexões clínicas e pessoais. Esse livro vai ser publicado pela Ruth Williams e provavelmente vai estar já pronto para venda em 2003. Esse livro, né, Ruth, ele já está anunciado no site da Ruth Williams, né? E quem quiser ter acesso com os capítulos, a descrição dos capítulos já está colocado lá. Ruth, prazer te receber. Eu já conhecia você do teu livro primeiro, dos Fundamentos, um livro bastante interessante, porque é um livro introdutório, mas é um livro que levanta algumas boas questões, nos faz pensar. É um livro bastante, eu diria, vai além dos fundamentos, por isso que eu acho que ele se faz tão útil. E para nós é um desejo, é uma grande alegria te receber. Espero que você se sinta à vontade. Tiaços é um projeto que já está em curso há 2 anos e há algum tempo nós queríamos te convidar. Fico feliz de você ter aceito o nosso convite desde o início. Por favor, sinta-se à vontade, tá? A casa é sua. Obrigado pela tua presença.
Oh, thank you so much for such a lovely welcome, Marcus. And thank you very much to you and to Theatos for inviting me. It's an absolute honor and a joy to be here. It's delightful to hear that you read the book. And I'd be so happy if it was translated into Portuguese so that it was available widely in your part of the world, because there are so many people interested there, I know. But I won't go into a sales pitch. What I wanted to talk about today is based on a chapter in the new book entitled Exploring Spirituality. And it'll be out at the beginning of next year, about somewhere in February. And I'm going to begin by talking about soul, then spirit and chakras. And finally, I'll say a little bit about a research project I did for the book, which maybe some of you took part in. And I'd definitely be interested to hear any of your responses if you did. So to begin with soul, listening to the call of the soul and spirit is our quintessential task in life. Learning to distinguish between the different calls on our attention is not easy. And that's the challenge we're constantly set. Is this intuition or fear or anxiety? Maybe it's paranoia. Sometimes it's difficult to distinguish and to think, is this the call of my soul, or is it one of these things? And individuation is about aligning with your soul, searching to find your purpose. Addictive thinking, obsessions, or desires to conform or please can be compelling and convince you that you're following the right path. Hormones exert great influence. responsibilities abound, families make demands, and all of these things make listening to the sometimes quiet insistence of the soul's beckoning quite a challenge. We might attune to this beat through dreams or synchronicities. Dreams are, for some, the only connection to a life beyond the diurnal realm, which makes that connection so vital and meaningful. A synchronicity can land like a thud that's impossible to ignore and brings a sense of what is kind of meant, a sense of being guided. And the trick is to pick up that track and to follow it. And the more aligned you are with your heart and your soul, the more rooted you are in your body and instincts, the lighter your step, you could say, the easier it becomes to follow the call. Of course, following your own star is never and can never be easy. Mythologist and storyteller Michael Meade recounts a wonderful tale of Isaac being called by a dream 3 times, which tells him to travel to a distant city where he'll find a great treasure at the foot of a bridge. Finally, after the 3rd dream, he can resist that call no longer, but feels foolish and inhibited from digging for the treasure as there were guards around on the bridge. But after days of pacing up and down, one of the guards approaches Isaac and asks if he's all right. Isaac swallows his vulnerability in feeling quite foolish about taking a dream so seriously and tells the guard why he's there. The guard agrees it's silly to listen to a dream and tells Isaac that he himself had had a dream the previous night where a man called Isaac is told to return home and look behind the loose bricks of his hearth, where he'll discover a great quantity of gold. After writing this, I came across another version of this story, which purports to originate in Germany, where a man finds a copper strongbox full of gold coins under a tree. So the same story, basically. So soul is at the very heart of depth encounters in life. We may not use that language, but we sure recognize that depth when we experience it. And I have a little quote here, the first slide on the PowerPoint projection, which somebody is very kindly going to put up on the screen. Shall I just wait for that to come up? Here we go. The first quote is one from Marion Woodman. The next slide, where she says, we all experience soul moments in life when we see a magnificent sunrise, hear the call of the loon, see the wrinkles in our mother's hands, or smell the sweetness of a baby. During these moments, our body as well as our brain resonates as we experience the glory of being a human being. Most of us long for what we call a soul mate, although that term has become somewhat cliched. The company of those with whom we feel such a close affinity is beyond measure and makes life feel fully lived and valuable. We feel understood and recognized when we resonate with each other's souls. In classical antiquity, souls are seen as already connected in the world soul or anima mundi. So perhaps it's no wonder we feel something move when we meet a fellow traveler whose soul touches ours. Writing in 1964, James Hillman noted, I think there's a slide for this one, the next slide, where he says, soul is not a scientific term, And it appears very rarely in psychology today, and then usually with inverted commas, as if to keep it from infecting its scientifically sterile surround. I'm not sure that much has changed in straight psychology in the decades since Hillman wrote those words. But in analytical psychology, Jungian psychology, soul is at the forefront of our explorations, and this paper seeks to draw that out. Hillman was, of course, the preeminent writer in this field on the subject of soul. And he goes on to play with the idea that alongside a case history, analysts might take a soul history when first meeting a patient, which I think is a really great and interesting idea. And the way he talks about it is set out in the next slide, please. He says, case history reports on the achievements and failures of life with the world of facts, but the soul has neither achieved nor failed in the same way. Its material is experience, and its realizations are accomplished not just by efforts of will. The soul imagines and plays. Taking a soul history means capturing emotions, fantasies, and images by entering into the game and dreaming the myth along with the patient. Taking a soul history means becoming a part of the other person's fate. Soul's facts are symbols and paradoxes. So I don't know how many people here are practitioners, but I think this is something that's really worth thinking about. And as you probably know, psyche and soul as terms are used interchangeably in Jungian discourse. Soul for Jung was the very essence of relationship, and a good deal of his mature work is concerned with soul. Indeed, psychotherapist, the very word itself, means healer of souls, which is in stark contrast to the current political moves based on financial expediency to turn state-provided therapy, in this instance, in this country, by the National Health Service, into a manualized practice, sometimes even excluding the presence of an individual altogether and using a computer program. It's absolutely mad. Nothing could be further from the actual origins of what true psychotherapy is about, when two individuals meet together in a room. And the morning I was writing this, there was a radio report about the British Medical Association having published research showing the results of working with a computerized therapist, as they put it, and a cognitive-based human therapist were indistinguishable, they said, which just makes me sigh. It's just ridiculous. It's just so mad. But this, alas, and of course I'm sorry to say I don't know the situation in Brazil, but this is the situation in Britain, where there's kind of a class apartheid that's been created, whereby those with few financial resources are left to take that scrap from the table, while the middle classes who can afford it are able to access proper therapy from a practitioner and of a modality of their choosing. And again, nothing could be further from the origins of the meeting of two individual souls in the service of healing. And it's just not a good situation. And indeed, I would say it's damaging to the soul. I'm just going to take a sip of water for a moment. Both soul and spirit go beyond sexuality, if I can put it that way. They may both be experienced as an aspect of sexuality, as well as more broadly as the deepest layers of our beings. When our souls or spirits meet in sexual congress, the greatest depths or heights are encountered. soul might be experienced like a bass note, and spirit, you might feel, is more like a kind of high ethereal tone. And the arc of the journey of the soul is slow and is discernible over years, whereas the spirit can move like lightning. Not always, but it can. Soul, you might say, is connected to the earth and to water, which links us or roots us to the earth, creating a channel to receive the healing energy which comes up from Gaia. Soul connects us through our bodies to the chthonic levels. Spirit is connected to fire and earth. It metaphorically takes us up. Our spirit rises, transcending the diurnal realm. And you might say that soul is like a membrane that links the physical world to the spirit. It gives us access on the physical plane on which we live to spiritual experience. And these are all things that I'd be really interested to hear if you agree, disagree, if you experience things in a similar way or not. I'm going to move here to talking more specifically about spirit. For Jung, as for me, spirit is not a concept, but rather an empirical phenomenon which may be experienced by anyone and indeed everyone. When I refer to spirit, I'm referring to the spiritual aspect of ourselves. I'm referring to the transcendent dimension of existence rather than paranormal spirits, which is the subject of a different part of my book altogether. Spirit is also seen as the energizing element in creativity, whereby you might feel as if words are writing themselves or a painting is painting itself. The Newman or the uplifting nature of a work of art may be experienced as spiritual. Indeed, Jung wrote a whole volume on the spirit of man, art and literature, which includes his essays on Picasso and James Joyce's Ulysses. And I'm not saying that these works were necessarily inspired by spirit, as much as perhaps moved by spirit. An example of that might be when I'm writing. I will sometimes wake with words going through my mind, which I have to dash to catch as I wake up, as they're often nuggets of gold, which were not in my conscious awareness, in much the same way that a dream image might be haunting me as I awaken, and I have to rush to my desk to kind of write it down or put it on my phone to record the image so that I can hold on to it and work with it. Because these moments are fleeting and precious. In my first book, Jung the Basics, I cite a number of examples of artworks and scientific findings having been dreamt, such as Paul McCartney dreaming his song Yesterday, which I'm sure you all know. And Paul McCartney, he calls it magic, which in a way you could say it is. And of course, there are copious examples of inspiration having arrived via dreams, which feel as if they're a gift from God or from the other side, or you'll interpret that through the lens of your own belief system, however you conceptualize that, and may have other ideas about the source. But that's how I think about it. But however you do conceptualize such experiences, they do leave an indelible impression and are experienced as precious. It's spirit that we aim, to which we aim our prayers, and perhaps how we experience our prayers being answered. Although that may of course, not be directly in the way we wished. They may not happen in the way that we wish, is what I'm trying to say. Spirit has the greater wisdom beyond our own perspective as to what we might need, which is what I think people sometimes get very frustrated about when they have a kind of very narrow goal in their wishes or prayers. But actually what we need is coming from a bigger perspective. For those interested in looking into Jung's perspective on spirit academically, a journal article appeared by a Danish practitioner which looks at the development of Jung's use of the term across his lifetime, which incorporates a broad spectrum of views. It's a very interesting article by Gitz Johansen in the Journal of Analytical Psychology. And Gitz Johansen discusses Jung's Spirit of the Times and Spirit of the Depths, which, as you probably know, he describes in the Red Book. But these may be seen as complexes which lead Jung or connect him to the world of soul. Jung used this way of referring to the spirit of the times and of the depths to elaborate his own thinking about the world of soul and spirit as he experienced it. They certainly have a numinous quality and operate at a deep level, but may be distinct from what I'm referring to as the spiritual dimension of life, which is seen as the divine spark of life, which animates us all and which some call God. And I'm not referring to a supernatural God who resides somewhere up there or out there, as some people think about it, or as religion can think about it, but to an energy which is omnipresent, meaning both out and most specifically inside each of us, although at a level which frankly inside and outside have no meaning. This is what the alchemists refer to as quinta essentia, the quintessence of our very nature, which is different to what Jung refers to as the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths, which might be thought of as God images or images of the gods in a metaphorical or mythological sense. Another way of looking at this may be that archetypes, which have complexes at their core, may carry the message of spirit in the sense that the right people may appear at the right time, or archetypal characters in myth and fairy tale carrying that salient message which is needed in order to get onto the right path may arrive, for instance. And you might think about those as sprites rather than spirit, although that's perhaps dancing on the head of a pin, but these are kind of very fine points of difference, which may not be strictly relevant, really. Jung saw spirit along these lines when he characterized spirit as fragments of the psyche. However, they don't need to remain split off and can be married within the overarching psyche. This is the ultimate work which culminated in Jung's mature opus on alchemy. These facets of life need to be incorporated in order for us to become more whole and connected to our fullest potential as humans. Not just for ourselves, of course, as individuals, but for the healing of the world too, I would say. We can all witness the consequences of narcissistic self-absorption in the world around us if soul and spirit are left out of the equation. And I won't mention any names, but I'm sure many names come to mind automatically when I say that. There are so many examples. I'm just going to take a sip of water again. I'm going to move on from here to touch on chakras. if you think in chakras, soul relates to the root or base chakra known as Muladhara in Sanskrit. It's located around the perineum and is associated with the color red. While the crown chakra, Sahasrara in Sanskrit, is associated with the color violet or white and is the door to the spirit, the divine light, which is seen as the source. So the perineum is at the base of the body, and the door to the spirit is linked through the brow chakra, or accessed through the brow chakra, also known as Ajna in Sanskrit, and colloquially known as the third eye. Chakras are energy centers which connect our physical bodies with the spiritual realm via a kind of aura, a bit like the membrane I mentioned earlier. And there are 7 basic chakras, although some systems break them down into more, each associated with different parts of the mind and body. And in this table, I've got a slide setting the chakras out. I've set out the 7 chakras alongside the different aspects with which they're associated. And I won't go through them because the slide will stay up there and you can just scan that as I'm talking if you're interested. And I've listed them top to bottom to mirror the physical locality to which they're linked, although actually they're usually displayed the other way up, in line with the flow of energy which rises up from the root chakra. And that energy is known in India as prana and in China as qi. The flow in energy is represented par excellence in Kundalini, where the energy of the snake is seen as rising up through the body from the root chakra and climaxes in rising up through the crown up to the spiritual heights and awakening. Each chakra is also linked to an endocrine organ. So there are kind of multiple ways of looking at what can seem like a kind of nebulous idea, but actually they're rooted in the body, and you can learn to attune with them. And perhaps you already are. I mean, I have no idea, quite possibly. But what I find is that chakras can be helpful to locate the locus of a physical or emotional issue or discomfort in the work, which can then be attended to either through self-practice or with or by a healer. And the system of acupuncture, for instance, is based partly on chakra energy centers. In Taoist practice, the chakras are also described as the trunk of Tao. In that model, the sexual center is seen as the spiritual center, which reveres sexuality as sacred. And there's a wonderful recent book translated from Japanese by somebody called Chiga, C-H-I-G-A, which is based on his deep study of the Tao Te Ching, which is an ancient sacred treatise written by an older contemporary of Confucius. And in Chiga's travels in China, he met a holy man named Mr. M. And Chiga discovered that, in fact, the Tao Te Ching is written in a code using what are called shikuji, which are letters, the kind of script for the Chinese language, where the letters are, the code is that the letters replace the original letters used, where they have the same sound but a different meaning. And translation from from the one meaning to the other revealed a deeply sacred sexual meaning to the esoteric text. A practice Shiga discovered is called Yama, Y-A-H-M-A, which equates, it's something like yoga with its links to Kundalini and Tantra, which she describes in a very inspiring way. And he encountered this practice in a remote village in China, where he experienced what he called a oneness on earth. And this is the goal, although that's much too concrete, material word, really, of all spiritual practice. He recounts a harmony in the villages, which is all too distant from the lived experience of much of our lives in sophisticated, advanced, so-called Western economies. Shiga describes his wonder at what he witnessed in the remote village. And I can't recommend his book highly enough. It is absolutely fantastic. And if you go to the next slide, please, I've got a quote from his book where he says, their marital lives were not controlled by laws or government. According to the conditions, there seemed to be many patterns of marriage, such as one husband with some wives, one woman with some men, a night visitation marriage, and so on, all based on one husband with one wife. To my surprise, he says, even though several patterns of marriage existed freely, a perfect balance was kept as a whole. The whole of the relationship between males and females in this village created such a perfect harmony, as if all were united into one complicated organic existence. It was as if all people were lovers who understood each other, and no jealousy was felt because of physical contact with the opposite sex. It was because they didn't have a personal desire to seek for the opposite sex within their psyche, where they're satisfied with the great Tao. It was the same toward the other living beings. It was impossible to monopolize a fortune, and they didn't have a concept of fortune itself. After that experience, I came to marvelously understand the mental state in which people are so hungry for money or power. The desire by civilized people for tangible things is a compensation for lack of love. We've confused the spiritual world and the material world in our psyches. And I think it really takes quite a lot of attention to kind of stay with what he's saying, because it's so easy to think about a situation which I suppose in our society we would call polyamory. But it's difficult to kind of distance oneself from the difficult feelings of jealousy and rivalry and so forth that most of us would experience in that situation. But it seems that this set of circumstances is just on a completely different level. Anyway, that's something to think about. I want finally to move on to saying something about the research project I did in the book. And anecdotally, I found in my practice that the majority of people seeking Jungian analysis turn to that approach because they're looking for someone who's able to work with soul and spirit, or at least who values soul and spirit. And it may not always be obvious because many Jungian practitioners work with soul and spirit without ever mentioning those terms. It can be used in the most subtle of ways as it underpins much Jungian theory. But I thought it would be interesting to test my hypothesis in writing the book. And so I devised a set of 10 questions, which I decided to send to a broad span of Jungian analysts across the world. I wondered whether my experience would be universal, as well as whether there'd be a cultural or gendered dimension to my questions. And for the purpose of the project, I wrote to the chairs or presidents of all of the 69 Jungian societies in the IAAP, which I'm sure you all know is the overarching membership body for Jungian analysts worldwide. And I asked them to circulate my survey to their members, which is, there are currently about 3,500 Jungian analysts all over the world. I can't tell how many of my questionnaires were actually forwarded, and languages may well have been a barrier. As I'm sorry to say, I stupidly didn't even think in time about getting the questionnaire translated from English, which is crazy really, because I'm sure a great many more people would have been interested to respond if I'd made it accessible to them. So I'm sorry about that, but I just didn't think of it in time. I do know that one person in China actually spontaneously translated it for me, which for which I was very grateful. And so this means that it's difficult to know the percentage of replies I received, but I never intended this to be a kind of numbers game, so I wasn't really that worried about that. So the numbers involved in the research project make it statistically insignificant, so I don't draw any grand conclusions. By its very nature, the questions I asked were open and looking for narrative answers more than quantitative findings. But I did receive responses from all over the place. And it was interesting to see how what seemed obvious to one person seemed equally obvious in a completely different way to others. Perhaps life's always like that. In the questionnaire I sent out, I explained what I was doing and my purpose in writing. And I told them, of course, that any replies would be strictly confidential. And so the only thing that I would reveal would be the countries where people had answered, because there may have been some cultural significance. And if we could go to the next slide, please. I've just set out the questions that I asked for that project. And again, I won't go through them. You can scan them while I go along. And if you wanted to refer back to them in a moment in questions, that would be fantastic. I'd really be interested to hear. I was deliberately opaque in the questions about what I meant by soul and spirit, as I wanted everyone to respond from their own understanding and that of the people they work with. And most specifically, I didn't layer a religious connotation to their meaning, as principally it's not where I come from, although I realised that some, or perhaps even many of the analysts responding, may come from a religious tradition. I found it so interesting to read the responses to this survey. There's a wider range of views than I expected. Some are wide open and generous, while others were a bit more cagey. But perhaps that's inevitable when dealing with a subject which may be such a private matter. Also, for many, I will have been a stranger asking really personal questions. But in all cases, I'm so deeply grateful to the respondents for taking the time to reply and for sharing their thoughts and experiences so freely, which I hope people find of value. It's perhaps unsurprising that most of the respondents who took the time to reply to my questionnaire do engage with spirit and soul, however they define it. Because I expect if people don't, then they just would have ignored the questionnaire. I was rather struck, though, that few analysts identified a gender, class, or cultural component in whether and how soul and or spirit feature in analysis. It's quite a difficult question. And I wasn't thinking that anyone would be more or less likely to experience soul or spirit than anyone else, because they're universal experiences which arise in their many different guises across all cultures and times and genders. It may be that in some cultures it's more or less acceptable to talk about these matters. I do think class is a rather unexplored area in the literature and in trainings, certainly, which perhaps needs greater attention and might then help us identify whether it's a factor in the work. Certainly it's a factor in accessing analysis. One of the biggest obstacles in obtaining responses to my survey, I think, was discomfort around what might have been seen as introducing a topic into a session, as some people saw it. And I certainly wouldn't do that myself, as I don't believe it is the analyst's place to set any kind of agenda in that way. But there are times when identifying something as relating to soul or spirit can be deeply meaningful and helpful in the work. Indeed, you can palpably hear an intake of breath at times when you conceptualize things in those ways. I think it's a real relief to people to hear things picked up in that way. Revealing where we come from spiritually as an analyst is a big question. In some cases, it's publicly known through published writings, or we may be surrounded by giveaway signs in our consulting rooms. And these revelations need to be carefully calibrated, as analysts will be conscious of what they're revealing with these things. Partly it depends on where you are in your own spiritual journey, as much as how comfortable you are about being transparent about that aspect of life. I know some analysts sounded appalled by the idea of being candid about their beliefs, although personally I don't see it as a belief, whereas others completely take it in their stride. Most, though, treat these matters as part of the transference relationship and as any other phenomenon that might arise in the work. And some I noticed kind of defer to Jung and sort of say, well, this is what Jung would think. And it might be, there may be a view that whenever we discuss a dream, we're engaging with soul and spirit. I know many experience dreams as communications, not just from the unconscious, but from God or spirit, or however you might conceptualize that higher or more than personal aspect. And not surprisingly, many folk who fall into this category would be drawn to a Jungian approach for this inclusion of the spiritual realm. When a death enters the consulting room or a synchronicity, they often evoke a numinous feeling which automatically takes us into the realm of soul and spirit. So these matters then become hard to avoid. Death is present when we touch on these topics, inevitably. Do we soften in our bodies and open to the depth, or become frightened, rigid, or defensive when these things happen? Or perhaps we hide behind a professional persona. It takes courage to allow ourselves to be vulnerable when entering into such unknown territory for both analyst and analysand. This creates new levels of emotional intimacy in the analysing dyad, which may need to be managed internally on both sides. In general terms, older people tend to veer towards these topics when contemplating aging, wondering if they've lived well enough, for instance, wondering about the meaning of life and death. Whereas younger folk tend to come at this more often these days from eco concerns and thinking about the future viability of our planet. People question the values of living in a materialistic society. The neoliberal political agendas many of us have suffered in recent decades also tend to make us think more broadly about how we want to live and whether that narrow ego-centered mentality is fulfilling in the broadest terms. Just a final paragraph to round up. People seek out therapy and analysis for many different reasons, ranging from the ordinary mundane difficulties of day-to-day life we all encounter, to deep spiritual dis-ease and being stuck in patterns which might feel karmic or fixed, that need assistance to unpick. And the two are not necessarily entirely separate. I'm thinking of a patient who was doing office work for many years and felt her soul dying day by day with the daily drudge that work entailed. And it took a great many years for her to dig her way out of that grind, to manifest her gifts and discover how it was she came to be in such a position. And of course, that's not an unfamiliar tale with many patients. For her, the reasons were deep and partly hidden for many years in family secrets and extremely challenging to address. But she did break through the chains and found a fulfilling career in a field which truly felt like her right path in life. So such work is moving and transformational and does take enormous courage to dig so deep, but it is possible, as I'm sure many, if not all of you know. Okay, end.
Obrigado, Ruth, pela fala. A fala instigante, traz temas para a gente poder pensar. Bom, dando início aqui ao debate.
Yes. Yeah.
A gente vai abrir agora para perguntas. Quem desejar fazer questões, por favor, coloque o nome no chat e aí eu chamo para a pessoa fazer a pergunta. Ruth, queria começar com uma questão. Quer dizer, duas questões. Vamos lá.
Excuse me, just one sec. Yeah. Please, go on. Yeah.
A primeira questão é uma questão mais, talvez um pouco biográfica, pessoal. O que te levou a escolher esse tema para escrever esse livro? É a tua experiência clínica? É um tema que surgiu ao longo da tua prática como analista? É um tema que te interessa pessoalmente? Então, a minha primeira curiosidade é saber quais são os motivos que te levaram a ter que escrever um livro para responder ou indagar-se sobre essa questão. Vou fazer essa, depois eu faço a outra, tá bom?
Yeah. Okay, yes, that's great. It predates my ever being a therapist. My interest. I mean, I've had a spiritual practice since my early 20s. And so my journey to therapy came from my spiritual practice and has only kind of deepened and developed over the years and kind of become a clinical matter as well.
Tá. Uma pergunta derivada disso é pensar se que a tua formação é na Sociedade de Londres, né? a Sociedade de Psicologia Analítica. E como é que, se esse ambiente anglo-saxão, esse ambiente mais inglês do universo do mundo junguiano, ele é mais favorável ou não a essas questões? Porque me dá a impressão de que a escola inglesa de psicanálise junguiana ela não tem uma relação tão íntima com esses temas como outras escolas. Faz sentido para você?
I think I've understood, but it's not that my society is particularly spiritual. I mean, I think on some level, all Jungian analysts have an interest in spirituality, although not many people talk about it. I mean, as you probably know, in London, there are 5 schools, and one of them sees itself as more spiritual. But yeah, it's a kind of dual journey for me. So it doesn't come from my training. It comes from me.
Uhum. Tá. Lu, quer fazer uma pergunta?
Quero. Ruth, obrigada, super obrigada pela sua apresentação. Eu queria saber a sua opinião sobre essa linha de pensamento em que associa a alma ao princípio feminino e o espírito ao princípio masculino. Bom, primeiro que eu acho que é complicado a gente usar esses nomes, né, de masculino e feminino, é por isso que eu estou usando até o princípio antes. E aí eu queria entender se na sua pesquisa aparece alguma coisa. Você faz alguma pergunta lá de gênero, mas acho que não é especificamente essa, né, das associações de alma e espírito com gêneros. Então, eu queria entender um pouquinho como é que você aborda isso com os seus pacientes na clínica e como é que foi isso na tua pesquisa.
I think the whole idea of splitting soul and spirit, male and female, is nonsense, to be perfectly honest. And I know for many people, anima and anima are a terribly important part of Jung's psychology. But for me, that piece of theory is so deeply flawed that I don't use that. Mm-hmm. So for me, we all have soul and spirit. It's irrelevant what your gender is. The gendered aspect that I was trying to explore in the research project was not really about that, but about whether men or women were more likely to talk about those things. And I don't think I discerned any difference in that. But as I say, statistically, it's of no value, really. It's just all anecdotal replies. Yeah. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, Luciana.
Sim, respondeu sim. Eu queria emendar numa outra pergunta. Eu queria entender um pouquinho como é na sua prática clínica essa questão de como aparece a alma e espírito na transferência, na contratransferência, nos processos. Você estimula que esses assuntos venham à tona? Ou você revela quando eles aparecem?
There's no stimulating those topics, and it would be too intrusive to have that as an aim. Mm-hmm. But there are times when you might realize that that's what's being constellated. I mean, a kind of everyday example is somebody who I saw today, who is a young doctor who just hasn't really found his direction in life yet, or his specialty, I should say, really. And to me, that was very much about kind of aligning with his soul's purpose and finding the courage to acknowledge what his purpose is, because there were kind of whispers of it, but because of his psychological patterns, it kind of was in the way of him manifesting his soul's path. So I'm not necessarily talking about this in kind of grand terms of big spiritual experience. I mean, this is just kind of the everyday fare of therapy and analysis. Yeah.
Perfect.
Or when somebody meets a new lover, they might kind of be kind of going up into the spirit, and then that might need to be grounded. So it just comes in very everyday ways, but we might not necessarily use that language. Yeah.
Tem algumas vezes. E alguma vez você não observa isso nos processos terapêuticos? Isso não aparece?
I'm. You mean when I see it, but I don't pick up on it, or?
Não, às vezes isso não aparece, isso às vezes não aparece no processo, porque pelo jeito que você explicou agora, parece que isso é óbvio, que vai em algum momento isso vai eclodir. Às vezes...
Yeah. Many sessions, it's just about ordinary everyday things. It just might not be something that's at the forefront of our minds. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's very much along the lines of individuation. I mean, following the path of the soul is following the path of individuation. So you might conceptualize it in that way.
Mm-hmm. Ótimo. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Lu. Wagner, querido, contigo.
Olá, Mar. Ruth, primeiro, muito prazer em conhecê-la. E, de verdade, eu acho que você está sendo bastante corajosa, né, em abordar esses temas, né, quando, na verdade, existe toda uma resistência, não só no meio da psicologia, de modo geral, né, por parecer, às vezes, não científico, né, por abordar coisas, vamos dizer, ditas espirituais, né, como se isso se conectasse necessariamente a uma religiosidade, né? Então, assim, é muito difícil a gente fazer uma fronteira entre essas duas perspectivas. Mas, de qualquer forma, eu parabenizo você por essa coragem. Então, assim, Ruth, eu particularmente, em muitas situações clínicas no consultório, eu trabalho com a temática do suicídio, da morte, né? Que é um cenário que se afasta, né, da espiritualidade, daquele contato íntimo com a alma, né, com aquilo que a gente poderia, vamos dizer assim, que poderia significar o belo dentro da psicologia, né? O que faz, dentro da sua percepção, né, da espiritualidade, né, da alma, a pessoa, entre aspas, fazer uma escolha pela morte? O que seria? Obrigado.
Well, first of all, thank you, Wagner, for your lovely comments. I appreciate that. Do you know the work of James Hillman on suicide and the soul? yeah. I mean, that subject couldn't be closer to the whole depth of life and death and soul and spirit. I mean, nothing could be more meaningful, could it? So it is something that you'd have to be very courageous to approach in that way. But isn't that what it's utterly about? Well, on so many levels. I mean, what your religious or spiritual belief is about the act of suicide, of whether there's a life after death, if you have a right to take your life, all those sorts of things. I mean, there are just so many ways in which you would approach a subject through that lens. And it's difficult to really answer that, because often in the work, when somebody is truly suicidal, you're kind of drawn to kind of dealing with it in a very kind of boundaried way, because we're all terrified that somebody would actually act that out. It's the most difficult work, isn't it? But if somebody is able to talk about it from that depth perspective that doesn't involve action, but really allows them to reflect on the depths, then that's life-changing work, isn't it?
Se me permite, eu gostaria só de dar um complemento que a Ruth falou. Eu tenho percebido que a ideação suicida, né, ela cai drasticamente a partir do momento de uma escuta realmente acolhedora, né? Já vi muitas circunstâncias na minha frente em que a pessoa estava prestes a cometer o ato, né? E a escuta acolhedora, ela foi capaz de reverter o processo. Claro, nem sempre fui bem-sucedido, não vou dizer para você que sempre fui bem-sucedido, mas na maior parte das vezes você percebe o impacto na alma da pessoa de ser acolhida e ser escutada na sua questão.
That's the true psychotherapy, the true two people in the room together, meeting soul to soul, isn't it?
Obrigado, Ruth, perfeito.
Obrigado, Wagner. Ruth, queria te fazer duas questões também. Uma é, você acha que, de alguma maneira, com a publicação do livro vermelho e dos livros negros do Jung, quer dizer, o fato dessas publicações virem à tona, né, circularem como material pertencente também à produção do Jung, isso é uma confirmação a mais de que a teoria junguiana é uma teoria que pode dialogar, se confirmar como um espaço de troca entre a psicologia, as questões espirituais, propriamente mesmo as questões anímicas. Você acha que a publicação dessas duas obras ela dá uma nova direção ao pensamento junguiano nesse aspecto que você está trabalhando, de alma e espírito?
Yeah. Well, it certainly produced an industry of publishing about the Red Book. I think the Red Book and probably now the Black Books are becoming very idealized at the expense of people doing the work themselves, frankly. I mean, they are deeply admirable, there's no question, and interesting and worth exploring. But to me, the real work is doing our own internal journey and creating our own equivalent, whatever it might be. I don't know if
Quando
that...
você diz idealizado, essas obras serem tomadas como, entre aspas, modelos a serem seguidos?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, yes. Yes, yes.
Uhum.
No, I mean, the whole method of active imagination and using art are incredible tools which I use and recommend all the time. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is a bit tongue in cheek, but I mean, there are just so many books about the Red Book now.
Tá. Uma outra questão, Ruth, pensando nisso, o que você acha que impede, não possibilita a psicologia junguiana em tornar-se uma disciplina espiritual? O que impede o pensamento junguiano dele não tornar-se uma disciplina espiritual?
I don't think there's any obstacle apart from the sort of the need some people have to make it scientific. But to me, that it is just intrinsic in the ideas. And there's room for everybody. I mean, everybody works from their own perspective. Some people have a more scientific bent, and some people have a more artistic bent, and some people approach it from a more spiritual place. But it's the same thing, and we engage with it in our own ways. But some people are very uncomfortable with thinking about the idea that a psychology could have a spiritual dimension. I don't know why, but they do.
Você diria que é preconceito?
Well, possibly. I mean, I think some of it's about respectability. And of course, the Jungian field doesn't have a good reputation in some parts. I mean, of course, I can't speak about your part of the world where I know it's very, very popular and probably has a different kind of image. But in this country, the Freudians are seen as very respectable and pucker, and Jungians are seen as a bit mad. And so it's kind of about that.
Ok. Martinha, querida.
I mean, I'm sorry. Go, yeah.
Por favor, continua.
Well, I'd be interested to hear if it has the same sort of reputation in your part of the world.
Quem falaria? Luciana, fala.
Não, você sabe que eu lembrei do congresso que o Sonu Chandassani veio falar, que foi aonde? Bento Gonçalves? Aquele de Foz do Iguaçu?
Foi.
Alguma coisa assim, e que ele estava comentando sobre o Jung científico e o Jung místico, e teve uma reação horrorosa na plateia. Muita gente concordando, mas muitas pessoas revoltadas em a gente, e o Sonu falar que a gente precisava assumir o lado místico do Jung.
Yeah. Yeah. For many of us, that's what's attractive.
Agora, Ruth, eu vou passar a pergunta para a Marta, depois eu volto à questão da respeitabilidade. Depois eu volto. Martinha, contigo.
Primeiro, assim, obrigada,
Okay.
Ruth. Gostei muito, achei muito interessante a palestra. E eu fiquei muito intrigada com o que você falou, quer dizer, assim, até um pouco sobre o terapeuta computadorizado, né? Assim, eu não conhecia isso, que você falou aí do sistema, né? Mas eu fiquei assim com uma ideia, né? Assim, uma pergunta. Não poderia, quer dizer, mesmo, né, de uma certa forma, tendo essa imagem, né, de uma coisa robótica, já só os algoritmos, mas a questão do fazer alma, né? Quem está se colocando, né, numa questão de análise, mesmo com respostas de algoritmos, isso não poderia abrir para novas questões, né? Quer dizer, a alma poderia ser feita também, né, nesse tipo de terapia. É só uma fantasia minha.
No. You see, that's the scientist's ideal. They would like to make the robot appear as if it had soul and feeling, but it will always be a robot. Yeah.
Sim, sim. É que eu me lembrei, só concluindo, eu me lembrei de um trecho de uma música do conjunto aí britânico, né? Emerson, Lake and Palmer, muito antiga, né? Em que tem um finalzinho, Carn Evil, terceira impressão, que ele fala exatamente com um robô, né? E ele fala assim, o robô diz para ele assim, né? Eu permito que você viva, né? Mas aí o homem, é uma conversa entre um homem e o computador. E ele fala assim, mas eu te criei. Aí o robô fala assim, o que mais você pode fazer? Ele fala assim, eu posso fazer o que é certo. Aí o robô fala, mas eu sou perfeito. Então, quer dizer, que ideia é essa, né? Entre a criação, criação, né? Que eu acho que não que possa ter alma, né? Mas eu achei interessante essa, né? Essa fantasia, né? Que também nos percorre, né? Não sei se você conhece essa música. É um conjunto do...
No, I don't.
É um conjunto de rock progressivo, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, da década de 70. Em inglês. Tá?
I remember them. I have seen them. I saw them in the 70s, but I don't remember that song. But it's an interesting idea because, of course, what makes us human is that we can't be perfect. It reminds me of that story about Persian rugs, where they always create a mistake in it on purpose because only God can be perfect. Yeah.
Obrigada.
Obrigado, Martinha. Neuza, contigo. Tudo bem?
Olá, muito obrigado pela excelente palestra, gostei muito também. E queria falar o seguinte, eu sou brasileira, mas estou morando aqui em Portugal. E quando eu fui fazer meu reconhecimento dos meus diplomas pela universidade aqui em Lisboa, eles não reconhecem nenhum título junguiano, porque diz que isso não é psicologia, isso é qualquer coisa místico, mas eles não consideram como psicologia. Então, nós estamos aqui na luta para ver começar um núcleozinho de trabalho por aqui. Então, essa é a situação. Mas a minha pergunta é outra, né? Eu acho que desde quando a gente separou, né, a ciência e a religião, e, portanto, a psicologia da espiritualidade, né, eu vejo assim que nós, psicólogos, e muito de nós temos muito medo de trabalhar com o paciente quando ele tem uma experiência transcendência, uma emergente espiritual. Muitas vezes a gente considera como um surto psicótico, logo encaminha para um psiquiatra para se defender. Ou então, por exemplo, numa imaginação ativa, se aparece uma figura, aqui, por exemplo, o nosso grande medo de Exu, né, por exemplo, que é uma divindade, um orixá brasileiro, da religião brasileira. Então, eu queria saber como é que você contasse um pouquinho para a gente como é que você trabalha, né, com essas situações, na relação terapêutica, como é que aparece na transferência, na contra-transferência, como é que você consegue trazer isso para a psicologia, né? Porque muitas vezes a gente fica com muito medo de sair do setting analítico. Nossa, mas você fez isso? Pessoas perguntam, né? Como se fosse um absurdo eu estivesse saindo do setting analítico.
Well, there are different things to respond to here. There is no leaving the analytical setting. Addressing things in terms of soul and spirit is the work. That it's not an offshoot, or it's not something unorthodox or unethical, if I can put it that way. It is the work. But you do raise a very important point that some people mistake psychosis for spiritual, and that's a very difficult and dangerous line to work with and define sometimes. But again, what I was talking about predominantly is not a kind of high-flown, huge experience that might look like psychosis. It's just very ordinary. The soul and the spirit are part of ordinary life. It's not necessarily a kind of heightened experience that appears dangerous, like psychosis. Does that make sense?
Sim.
It is very difficult. I mean, I had somebody a few years ago who became quite psychotic through taking drugs, and he thought he was on a deep spiritual journey, and actually I could not do the work with him because he was just way out there. And so I didn't engage, which made him very angry, because that's what he was coming for. He wanted a spiritual journey, but being high on very dangerous drugs is not a spiritual journey. It's very difficult to kind of get into all the subtleties. For instance, I'm thinking even on the news yesterday, there was an item about using psilocybin for depression, which is being used in very small dosages and is extremely effective and can be used in a safe way. But in other hands, it can be completely out of control and make people quite ill. So it's tricky territory. Psilocybin, which is the it's from magic mushrooms, basically. Yeah. Yeah.
Obrigado, Neuza.
Obrigada, Max. Obrigada, Ruth.
Ruth, vou te fazer algumas perguntinhas breves, entre aspas, para a gente encaminhar.
Okay.
O título do seu livro novo é Espiritualidade a partir de uma perspectiva pós-junguiana. Queria que você nos dissesse como é que você entende a expressão pós-junguiana hoje, no mundo contemporâneo. É importante para você marcar essa posição? Essa é uma questão de muito debate aqui no Brasil. Os pós-junguianos são muito mal compreendidos aqui, então, para nós é importante ter a tua opinião.
Well, I'll tell you a secret. I didn't choose that title originally. The title I wanted to have was Humans Being Grace, because that's what the book is about. But that is not a Routledge title, and they didn't like it. So they made me use a title that sounded more scientific. I mean, post-Jungian basically just means the generations that have come subsequent to the kind of first generation who were around Jung when he was alive, basically. Although Stefano has complicated matters by now talking about Jungian ancestors and neo-Jungians, he calls it. Which is slightly different, and I'm not very clear about the distinction he's making, but I think he's wanting to make a distinction because I think he feels like the next generation after post-Jungians, so the kind of my age group. So I don't find it a very complicated thing, but there might be something to your thinking about that I don't understand. Is there something more that you mean?
Não, aqui no Brasil, a expressão pós-junguiana ela é erroneamente confundida como superação de Jung, uma declaração de anacronismo do Jung.
Oh, I see.
Que não tem nada a ver com a maneira como o Samuels a definiu. Né? Pós-junguiana é uma leitura crítica, é um olhar crítico, atento, uma leitura cuidadosa do texto do Jung. Não, nada tem a ver com uma ideia de superação ou avanço no sentido de descarte. Então, é uma expressão que causa... Pois é, mas é uma expressão que no Brasil ela causa muito ainda barulho pela má compreensão. Por isso que eu me interessei por saber.
I see. It is a misunderstanding. That's not what Andrew Samuels meant by post-Jungian at all. I think he meant it in quite a matter-of-fact way. Just the generation or two that has come since Jung's death, those that weren't around him personally. And so those who've developed the theory beyond his kind of original oeuvre.
Duas últimas perguntas. Quem no mundo junguiano hoje, quem você lê no sentido de que trabalha com uma perspectiva semelhante à sua? Você tem autores com quem você divide esse tema da espiritualidade? Quem é a sua turma?
I have no personal group. I mean, Jerome Bernstein springs to mind. I mean, he's sort of in that ballpark, but not really. So I don't think there's anybody really. I don't think. Can you think of anybody else?
Pois é, eu estava aqui tentando lembrar.
You know Jerome Bernstein in Santa Fe, New Mexico? He wrote Living in the Borderland, which is a spiritual perspective, although it's sort of different. He's got his own shtick. Yeah.
Tá. E, Ruth, a última pergunta. Se a gente ainda quisermos manter o valor da interpretação como um conceito, uma ferramenta analítica, a experiência espiritual, ela é interpretável?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I mean, I think naming an experience is enough when something like that is happening. I don't think it requires an interpretation, because it would diminish it and become an intellectual concept. So it would take you away from the kind of deep experience. But sometimes just kind of acknowledging, gosh, we've really hit something here, haven't we? Sort of thing. That might be enough for you both to kind of stay with that resonance. And so that you're both recognizing something.
A nomeação por si só já bastaria, já seria suficiente. Suficientemente bom.
I mean, it's difficult to sort of answer just kind of randomly, not talking about a particular instance. But you don't want to kind of ruin the experience by kind of turning it into something that would sort of take the air out of the bubble, so to speak. And perhaps after the event, there's time to kind of think about things more cognitively. Sometimes sitting in the silence and just kind of being with that experience is enough.
Gostei da frase não arruinar a experiência. Acho que é uma boa dica. Funciona como uma boa linha de condução. Não arruinar a experiência. Ruth, obrigado. Obrigado pela tua presença. Foi um prazer te ouvir. É um tema, como você percebeu pelas perguntas, é um tema que sempre mobiliza por demais, né, a todos. Eu acho que é um tema que ainda, de alguma maneira, como o Wagner mencionou aqui, né, tem uma coragem grande da sua parte em trazer esses temas à tona, e acho que é fundamental que a gente possa discutir, trazer, e, por que não, aproximar ou confirmar a psicologia junguiana como uma relação de vizinhança com esses territórios do espiritual, da alma, anímicos. Queria te agradecer, tá? Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate. It's been really lovely. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah.
Espero que a gente possa te rever em breve. Quando o seu livro for lançado, nós convidamos você novamente para vir falar dele. Tá bom? Muito obrigado pela sua presença.
Thank you. No, bye-bye. Yeah. Bye.
Pessoal, obrigado pela presença do Tia Assos, né? Mais uma grande convidada a nos brindar com a presença. E sexta-feira que vem, né, Lu? Temos Eva Zóia, não é isso?
Eva Zóia. Quando a alma encontra a matéria, aplicações clínicas e sociais no sandplay junguiano.
Vai ser bem legal, né? Eva
Alma,
Zóia,
continuamos no tema da alma.
Continuamos no tema da alma, agora com a alma e a matéria. Eva Zóia, Sandplay, sexta-feira, 4h. Tá bom? Pessoal, obrigado. Ruth, abraço.
Bye-bye. Bye. Yeah.
Bye, thank you, Ruth.